being co-hosted by India International Center and Institute of Chinese Studies. And we are very fortunate to have with us this evening Professor Krishna Palepu. I don't have to give his background to you. You're familiar with his background. Professor Palepu, as you know, is with Harvard University. Is Ross Graham Walker Professor of Business Administration and also Senior Advisor to the President of Harvard University. He was with us the previous weekend. We hosted India Forum on China at Goa, and there the subject was changing drivers of Chinese economy, and he spoke on the issue of can China innovate. We had very good discussions in Goa, but we wanted him to interact with this audience in Delhi as well, and we suggested for his consideration a more sort of broader theme, which is China's rise and its implications for the world. This is one subject which is attracting a lot of attention. This is something, China's rise, its transformation, what has happened over the last 4 decades has not only led to amazing transformation of Chinese society, economy, polity, but also kind of impact it has had on the world at large. Later this month, China will be marking 40th anniversary of the launch of reforms and opening up in December 1978. It's in a way, at a turning point in terms of many of its policies, including how it engages with the rest of the world and how the rest of the world engages with it. In fact, one subject which came up repeatedly in our deliberation at Goa was the ongoing US-China so-called trade war, and how it was not just about trade but much wider strategic contestation between the two, and how perhaps China-US relations are undergoing a fundamental shift, how it's going to affect the rest of the world. In fact, I was reading on my way to IIC a very interesting article by Yan Xuethong, a very well-known Chinese strategic thinker, was Dean of Institute of International Relations at Tsinghua University. Just 2 days ago, he wrote this article for Foreign Affairs, The Age of Uneasy Peace, Chinese Power in Divided World. And he argues that the world is moving towards a bipolar arrangement, and it's something which is going to happen. It's just what kind of arrangement it will entail. That's a matter of speculation. And he has suggested that this bipolar arrangement, where China will be the junior superpower, as he puts it, will involve most states adopting a two-track foreign policy, siding the United States on some issues and China on others. And he makes another point which is rather interesting, and I'm just trying to provoke Professor Palepu, because he said he feeds on what he gets from audience, so I'm just feeding a few questions to him. He suggests that there's a lot of discussion going on in China on what's going to happen down the road. And one term in particular has been making the rounds in Beijing. That's Wang Tao. He translated it as humane authority. The word represents a view of China as an enlightened, benevolent hegemon whose power and legitimacy derive from its ability to fulfill other countries' security and economic needs in exchange for their acquiescence in Chinese leadership. This is a leading Chinese strategic thinker sort of projecting what kind of role China is going to. They have come a long way describing China as a benevolent hegemon and which provides certain global public goods in exchange for acceptance of Chinese leadership. Without much ado, we'll have many more questions for you, Prof. Palepu, but I just wanted to throw up some issues for your comment. He has indicated that it will be fairly wide spectrum remarks by him about future of China, what kind of scenarios he envisages, what kind of challenges China is going to face, what kind of implications rise of China and continued future trajectory of China will have for the rest of the world. So over to Prof. Palepu.
Thank you, sure. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for all coming here this evening. I'm not a China expert. I just want to kind of start by saying that I'm more of a comparativist, not an area specialist. I have done work over the years on emerging markets as a business school professor. And obviously you can't do work in emerging markets without doing a lot of work in China. And so I got quite a bit of exposure to China through that process. But I also had the privilege of thinking about China in comparison with many other economies. And so that's actually part of the perspective that I'll bring. I have been going to China since 1995, at least a couple of times a year, maybe 3 times. I had the privilege of living in China for a while on a research fellowship. I have taught many Chinese senior executives and entrepreneurs over the years in programs that we have, and spend time with them in their companies and visiting their factories. So I have a lot of ground level, micro kind of understanding of what's happening in China. And of course, you can't do business in China without thinking about the financial system and the government. And therefore, I also had occasion to kind of spend time talking to a lot of government officials, people in the financial system, just to understand what their thinking is. So I'm going to kind of weave a bunch of observations based on all that knowledge that I have. But I think what I would really love to do is start the process and then interact with you and really have you make comments and questions, and then I would react to that. So that would actually be my preferred way of spending this hour and a half with you. I think while the topic is really the future, it really always helps if we take stock of how we got here. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about that, and then spend a bit of time speculating about where we might be headed. And it's a good occasion, actually, this 40th year of Chinese liberalization is a good occasion to think about how China, in fact, ended up being the second largest economy in the world just in the span of 40 years, which is a spectacular achievement in human history. It hasn't happened so fast in almost any other society. So we need to kind of think a little bit about how they achieved it before we think about what the implications are for future. And there are many ways to skin this cat, but I have a very simple way that I understand this. Chinese people, which are billion and odd people, had a per capita income rising from about $300 to about $8,000 today. And that can't happen unless people just become more productive, because ultimately at the end of the day, per capita GDP is essentially output per person in some sense. And so the question is, how did Chinese people become so productive in a span of 40 years? And by the way, we used to, when I was growing up here, there is this issue that it is population an asset or a liability, and generally there was this sense that we have too many people, we have to feed them, it's a liability. But I think what China has done is convert its people into an asset, fundamentally, and make them more productive. And the question is, what are the tools that China has used in doing it. And you can use just common sense and kind of thinking through this. People can't be productive, first of all, unless they're healthy. If you think about people going to work, and if they're not healthy, they're partially healthy or periodically sick, they can't be productive. So I think investing in health, basic health, is a very important thing, and China has done that. You need to have skills and education. If you go to work, you should be able to do things. And so investing in elementary education, primary education, secondary education, to get massive number of people just get to be productive workforce. Very important thing that China has done. Provide them with tools and technology, very important. And so China was very strategic in thinking about inviting FDI in upstream technologies as they're focusing on downstream work. Let me give you an example, for example, of construction, which has been a major driver of Chinese growth over the years. But if you go to a construction site in China and compare it with a construction site in India, the role of technology and machinery is radically different even today. And China invited companies like Komatsu, Caterpillar to come and establish 100% owned subsidiaries in China as early as like 1980. And as the China construction boom was going, they created the tools that are needed for workers so that actually construction can be done in a very productive and efficient way. Starting with diggers all the way to very sophisticated cranes and everything else in between. And so by liberalizing parts of the value chain that are needed for the rest of the value chain to become productive, I think that's something China has done very well. And of course, infrastructure is a very important component of making people productive. And if you just visualize a day in the life of a worker, if you're healthy, you know what you're doing, you have tools and technology, and actually you can go to work and come back fast, and whatever output you have can be then linked with other people's output easily because of infrastructure. You can see how actually productivity can be driven. And then of course the fundamental liberalization started with the recognition of market incentives. That is, if you don't have incentives, people don't use all these things productively. So it's just a very simple kind of formula, but I think it's a very well thought out, systematic kind of approach that really attacked the productivity. And I'm laying that out in part as a contrast to some of the issues we're facing in India even today. If you think about, pick up all these areas and say, where are we? We lag a lot, I think, in India in many of these aspects. Primary health, primary and secondary education, infrastructure, even availability of technology. These are all kind of hit or miss. And as a result, if you're a company and you are trying to actually be productive, it's not that easy. And so the same group of people, if all these conditions are met, can start becoming more and more productive over time. And that's actually the formula that China has used extremely effectively. And of course, the one last piece to make all this work is capital. And fundamentally, I think China has taken the step of commandeering capital in the economy. So the financial system, unlike the rest of the economy, is really not market-driven at all in China. China essentially confiscates all the savings in the economy through the banking system, which is controlled by the state, and then allocates that capital to its priorities. Over time, it has used it to develop infrastructure, the state-owned enterprise system, defense industries, all the strategic places that they want to invest the capital in. And that has helped actually the growth of the industrial base but it also laid the foundation for a very inefficient use of capital. So interestingly, while Chinese labor productivity has increased in close to like high single digits per year, every year for the last 40 years, I'm talking about growth in productivity. And the compounded effect of that is just amazing. If you're growing productivity at 8-9% a year for a 40-year time period, it's just phenomenal. The same person just starts being able to do more and more things. But capital productivity in China has been actually pretty poor. That's the trade-off that they made. Chinese are inveterate savers, as many Asians are, but one of the highest saving states in the world. But a lot of those savings are then really controlled by the government in some sense. So the bargain that Chinese people essentially have gotten is that they will get opportunities to be productive, but their savings are then going to be controlled by the government, which then is going to use strategically to kind of do all this stuff. The other element of it, of course, is building scale in anything that you do. And how do you build scale in a poor country? Because there's not enough demand for anything that you're producing. So obviously the only way you will build scale is if you focus on exports. And that's what is the foundation for the export-led type of strategy that China has used. So they have been able to produce massive amounts of things in any particular category because they're not focused on actually selling them just domestically but internationally primarily. The export-led economy strategy also allowed the government to do something else, which is not to let the productivity gains automatically accrue back to the workers. In general, in equilibrium, you would think that if people become more productive, their salaries will increase accordingly. But in China, in fact, the wage growth has almost always lagged productivity growth. So while productivity has been growing at 8-9%, wages have not been growing at 8-9%. And where does the differential go? It goes into reducing prices for customers who are buying the output. And so if, let's say, there's 8% increase in productivity, 4 might go to workers, but the 5 will go actually to customers. And the customers are not Chinese. So in essence, what was going on is that in fact, a lot of the productivity gains of Chinese workers, the hardworking Chinese people, have actually benefited the rest of us in the world. Anybody who is buying anything from China is actually getting a deal, in essence, because the Chinese workers are not getting paid fully for their productivity. This is, by the way, in contrast to, for example, what happened in the US auto industry, where wages actually have risen faster than productivity. And you can see what happens when that happens. Over time, the industry just dies. In China, it's been the opposite, and so the industry has been thriving and scale has been growing dramatically. And so it's this fairly simple kind of formula that I think China has repeatedly used in year after year after year to get to where it is. And in the process, obviously has dramatically improved the standard of living of Chinese, but also has, I think, laid the seeds for some of the challenges that the country is facing today. And by the way, this approach, in general terms, has not been invented by China, as we all know. It was used by Japan to some extent, not in all the details, but in rough outline, and then by Korea and Taiwan to some extent. To less extent Taiwan, but roughly the same kind of template has been very successfully used by Japan and Korea. And China followed that, but at a scale that is staggeringly larger compared to the scale of either Japan or Korea. And so, I think it's really important for us to keep this in the back of our mind as we're thinking about where China is today and where it is headed. And I'm going to kind of make some connections there. But I think the one thing that this approach has done is make China almost kind of integral to the rest of the world. So China is not a standalone economy by any stretch of the imagination, because this, by definition, required China being very integrated into the global economy in terms of supply chains, in terms of consumption patterns in the rest of the world, in terms of actually the economic consequences for the rest of the world. For example, inflation in the US in particular, but in the West in general, has stayed very, very low to a large extent because the productivity gains of Chinese workers have been passed on in lower prices to the rest of the world. And therefore, the rest of the world could run, for example, easy money policy without worrying about inflation, could consume a lot because essentially the purchasing power has been subsidized to some extent by Chinese policies of kind of not letting their own workers enjoy the fruits of their labor completely. And so there has been a lot of kind of integrated effect that this strategy has created. So China is not like in an isolation by any stretch of the imagination in any facet of its life. So there is another angle that integrates China with the rest of the world, which is human capital development. Because China really didn't have, in fact, it actively destroyed huge amount of its intellect and its education institutions before it liberalized. To catch up on human capital development at a higher level, that is a higher education, it had to depend on the rest of the world. And massive number of Chinese students have come to US universities today at Harvard, as well as in many, many other universities in the US. The number one country from which international students come is China by far. And that's been going on for decades now. And many of them are educated in the West. They're going back to China, participating in this journey. So while goods are getting exported, human capital was getting imported into China. And that is another source of integration with the rest of the world in a fairly serious way. Because when you send somebody abroad for education, they will not come unchanged. They come back with not only skills, but attitudes and everything else that they bring back as part of it, friendships, networks, everything else. And so because of all this stuff, I think that if you want to understand China, you can't think of China as an island. It's really a totally integrated country to the rest of the world. And any attempt not to disentangle it is not going to be pretty or easy. So it's just, you need to kind of think about all this stuff as we're kind of thinking about today's challenges or conflicts or whatever it is that, there's a very integrated kind of system that China has created for itself and for the rest of the world, for all of us too. So, where are some of the challenges that this same strategy has created for China? A bunch of internal challenges to start with. One is, human productivity has its limits. And so at some point, this close to double-digit growth in productivity cannot be sustained. And 40 years is a miracle that they have sustained it. But it's actually dropping off now. There is still some room because China is a vast country. There are many, many people who still are not part of the organized economy. They can be brought into the economy and you can run this cycle for a while. But definitely there are diminishing returns to this game of pure labor productivity oriented stuff. And it's manifested in many ways that all of us know. People are saying the wages are increasing in China, factories are moving to Bangladesh or Cambodia, maybe to India, because of the differential in cost. But that's not the right way to think about it, because when I talk to Chinese entrepreneurs, they don't think about just cost, they think about productivity. because you can have a lower cost employee, but if they're not very productive, it's not because of their fault, but actually the entire ecosystem in which they're operating, they're sick, they're absenteeism as a result, they don't have the skills, the infrastructure is not very good, the wage rate may be low, but actually the productivity is not going to be very high, and therefore it's not going to be good enough for them. But this game is definitely reaching its peak and kind of plateauing unquestionably. So that's one, they have to deal with that. The second one is because of the way capital has been mobilized for this growth story, the capital market development in China has really been stunted. And in some ways, actually, the India story is almost the mirror image of it. Indian capital markets have developed quite dramatically, actually, and they're much older than Chinese capital markets, and they, in fact, have been fostered much better. So the capital market development in India is miles ahead of the capital market development in China. The Shanghai Stock Exchange has a beautiful building, much better building than Bombay Stock Exchange. The technology is better, but the market itself is not very good. There's rampant insider trading, liquidity is poor, there is an information vacuum, the reliability of financial statements is poor, corporate governance is highly questionable. And so as a result, actually the capital market development actually has lagged the economic development by a lot. And also because capital markets have not developed, much of the financing is in the form of debt rather than equity. And heavy reliance on debt has its own problems, because when the economy starts becoming much more risky in the sense that you're actually not assembling low-tech things, but as you're moving up the value chain, financing has to mirror that. And in general, finance theory says that if you're doing more risky things on the business side, you should have less risky financing, and debt is more risky than equity, and so actually you need to have higher component of equity than that. But Chinese economy is not able to supply equity. It's still very heavily debt reliant economy. And that debt is allocated by state-owned banks, which are also very inefficient. They are not equipped to allocate capital in a very sophisticated economy. And so they make a lot of mistakes, and as a result, there is misallocation of capital, and also there is a tremendous amount of non-performing assets. And so there is that ticking time bomb that all of us are aware of. The low productivity of capital is a big problem too, because productivity of capital ultimately, by productivity of capital I mean something like return on capital invested. If you take the return on capital invested for the top 100 companies in China or top 200 companies, it's abysmally low. It's terrible. These companies produce amazing goods, so physically they look good, but financially they're not very healthy. They're not producing the kind of returns. What's the problem with not producing returns? The problem is, simply put, it's like the farmer planting seeds and getting less crop than the seeds. And if you keep doing it, you won't have too many seeds left to plant at some point, because you're not getting enough seeds back. And so return on capital is an important thing, and China really hasn't paid much attention to it. But who gets hurt by it in the end? It's the retirees. Because if you put your savings in a bank, and the bank is giving that capital out to people, and the return is low, the return you're going to get as a saver is going to be low too as a result of it. And China has been able to do that by controlling interest rates. But if you're getting 3% return on your savings, rather than, let's say, 8% return, that 5 percentage points difference compounded over a 40-year working age or 30-year working age is tremendous. And so you're not getting much return as a saver. And that's a real problem for the generation of all the people who worked in the last 30 years, 40 years in China, are now about to retire, but really don't have the kind of savings and the returns on it which then motivates them and their children to save a lot. Because the only way you can make up for not returns is by increasing your principal in some sense. And so the savings rates continue to be very high. And so you have this kind of funny financial system that is creating all kinds of wrong incentives for people. And at the same time, thanks to the 2008 financial crisis, suddenly there is now far less appetite on the West for consumption. Because the West itself got a big shock, and most of the countries in the West, Europe certainly is not growing at all, and US is growing, but at a 2-3% per annum at best. And so, and US consumers, because of the shock that they got in 2008, are changing their habits and actually reducing their consumption at the margin and increasing savings. Not dramatically, but definitely at the margin. And as a result, the markets in the West are definitely declining for Chinese companies. And then the obvious strategy would be to say, let's focus on domestic consumption. But if Chinese consumers are saving a lot because of the financial system problems that I just described, motivating them to consume is not easy. And so you have this issue of, how do you now shift the entire economy from a highly subsidized financial model that is leading to exports to a consumption-driven economy. A lot of things have to be changed simultaneously. You have to reform the financial system. You have to make it possible for people to consume more. You will have to pass on the productivity gains in the form of wages so that people have the money to consume. So you have to change a bunch of different things simultaneously. So China, the people that I have spoken with in very high levels of government are fully aware of all these things. That's the good news. But the bad news is simply because you're aware of it doesn't mean that you can change very easily, because there's a lot of political economy involved in all this stuff. There are a lot of vested interests that are all kind of plugged into the system, and changing all that stuff is a very hard thing to do. And also for bankers who develop bad habits of lending, it's not easy to suddenly become very sophisticated in their decision-making process. And so in every country where this kind of transition had to take place, there always have been banking crises, massive banking crises. And so China has been toying with the reforms, but really not pushing it too much, because if they push it too much, there could be a crisis. If they don't push it, you're really nibbling at the edges in this shift, but really not able to execute on that. So I think that's the horn of a dilemma that China has been sitting at least for a decade now, and it's not clear exactly where that is headed. Capital controls in the economy have helped China postpone dealing with this problem, because if the capital is open, a lot of people would be scared by this kind of scenario that I'm painting and pull capital out of the system and kind of take it elsewhere. But because of the capital controls, people are stuck. There's a little bit of capital that is fleeing China, but not as much as, for example, what happened in Korea in the 1990s, when Korean economy hit a patch like this, and there was panic and a lot of money left Korea in a very rapid manner. So capital controls are a big kind of deterrent for the crisis. But what that means is that there are limits to really China integrating itself financially with the global financial system. Because if you have capital controls, the talk of making yuan a competing currency for dollar is a joke, basically. It's not going to happen. And so there is that aspiration versus actually the reality of how do you deal with that issue. So there is one other dial that China is trying to turn, and this was the topic of my talk in Goa, which is if productivity is declining, historically in most societies, the only other driver that we know to continue the growth is innovation. That is, you essentially push the production frontier to the next level so that you are able to do more things with the same because of the innovation in the economy. And there's a lot of kind of question mark here. On the one hand, China has built a lot of human capabilities for innovation. It has invested a lot in people, as I said, that said going abroad and coming back, which has led to a resurgence in Chinese universities because there are many PhDs who are trained in first-class departments all over the world that are coming back and becoming professors at places like Tsinghua or Beida or many other places. So there is a human capital and rise of university system. But human capital alone is not enough for innovation. First of all, if you have a repressive financial political system, it's very hard for people to think out of the box. On top of it, if the education system is emphasizing conformance and rote learning rather than challenging status quo, it's very hard to do innovation. And so one could have a lot of skepticism about whether China in fact can move from a productivity-led economy that is geared towards exports to an innovation-led economy that is geared towards domestic market. But my own experience, ground-level evidence is actually that there is a lot of room for optimism here in the areas of market-led innovation in China. And it's happening in well-known companies like Alibaba, Ant Financial, Tencent, Huawei. So you have a group of companies that are well-known and are totally world-class in their own spaces and whatever they're doing. And much of that is really not, except for Huawei, not technology innovation, but actually business model innovation, that is doing things innovatively to produce goods and services for consumers and the customers in the economy. And China, and I'll be happy to talk more about those if you want me to later on, but we can just stipulate that there are actually places where there's tremendous amount of market-led innovation that is going on. This is also true, by the way, in mundane things like restaurants. You go to Shanghai or Beijing today, the kind of innovative restaurants that are addressing middle-class needs, that it's just amazing, actually, the amount of fermentation and innovation that is going on. So, same with clothing, furniture, all the kind of things that you think about, they're mundane things, but actually producing them in an innovative way to gear towards the needs of Chinese consumers. I think China is actually already on the way to that transition, and I see a lot of companies kind of doing that, thriving and succeeding quite effectively. And we're seeing actually some of the spillover of that coming into India. In fact, many of the cell phone brands that are very popular in India are all cell phones that have been created through innovative business models in China that are coming at the price points that are staggeringly low compared to Samsung or Apple, and that's what Chinese consumers like, and so they build scale, and that's what Indian consumers like. That's why they're all coming to India. Similarly, in construction equipment, the benefit to inviting companies like Komatsu and Caterpillar 40 years ago is that there is an entire ecosystem that has gotten developed. And there are many Chinese companies that are now actually quite good at producing medium range and maybe in some cases even high-end construction equipment. Sanye is a company that is in fact the largest construction equipment company in the world today. It has built a very big plant in Pune, trying to supply construction equipment to India. And so, there is that journey of companies doing not technology-led innovation, but consumer-led innovation, market-led innovation. There's a lot of that's going on in China. The evidence on the technology-led innovation is much less impressive. And Chinese government is very ambitious in this area, and you all know that they have a plan for fostering very big kind of sectors of cutting edge technology in artificial intelligence, in biotechnology, in robotics, and semiconductors and so on and so forth. But I think the ground level progress on that is still questionable in my opinion. This then leads to the last facet that I want to touch and then stop and open up for questions. I think one stark difference between the journey that Japan and Korea took versus China is taking at this juncture of its transition compared to their junctures of transition is Japan and Korea decided to focus further on the economic development at the expense of throwing their weight around in the international system. They basically have become benign economic agents. And the rest of the world then continue to cooperate with those countries and help them continue to become more and more economic giants. Unlike that, and also both definitely Korea and Taiwan too, around this time of the inflection point, started moving from being autocratic countries to more democratic countries, started opening up their political system. In both these areas, China has made a very different choice in the last decade or so. The political system, rather than becoming more benign, has become much more controlling and repressive in some ways. And China has also started positioning itself as a strategic rival to the United States. These are two very different choices that China has made that other rising powers have not made. And I think that's really the topic that we might want to talk about more. But it has profound impact for China, actually, and it has profound impact for the rest of the world. Because a lot of the collaborative efforts that the West, certainly the United States in particular, has done with China, starting with Nixon going to China, was the hope that economic development will lead naturally to a benign country that will be part of the global system. But this sudden shift in the last 5 years is giving a pause to a lot of people, saying that, okay, we agreed to a lot of things that are perhaps asymmetric. For example, when China was admitted into the World Trade Organization, there are a lot of promises that China made that it is not keeping up. Nobody is calling that out. The trade in general has been asymmetric, and most of the rest of the world was willing to put up with it. And all of these things, in some ways, you can think of as the rest of the world thinking that if they made investment in China, China then will become part of the fraternity of collaborating countries in the world. So suddenly this idea that after 40 years of going down that path of investing in China, the outcome is actually that you have a country that is both less democratic and also positioning itself as a strategic rival, is definitely, I think, raising a lot of eyebrows, and not just in political circles, but actually common people. I had the privilege of living in Europe after I lived in Shanghai. The same year, actually, I moved to Barcelona and lived for 6 months. And this was 5 years ago. And I can't tell you how many people were aghast that I spent 6 months in China. They thought that, what were you doing there? And the common people's visceral negativity to the Chinese oppression is how they think of both domestic oppression and internationally not being as collaborative is widespread, and in Europe definitely. And US probably was the most Pollyannish about this actually till last couple of years. And by the way, the skepticism about China in the US is bipartisan. Trump is loudest, but actually both Democrats and Republicans together are quite skeptical about what's happening. Japan obviously started becoming alarmed by this posture of China to start and dominating South China Sea and seeing itself as the guardian of the Pacific, taking that mantle away from United States. And so Japan has been alarmed by this. And of course the smaller Asia Pacific countries, which generally thought of the rise of China as a positive for them, are now kind of questioning whether in fact that's the case or not. India has always been skeptical, and I think India may be feeling like maybe it's getting vindicated a little bit today. And that's the feeling I get when I talk to people in India, that thank God everybody else is seeing China for what it is that we have been seeing for the last many years, and people are too optimistic. And the reason I'm taking it to that is you have a country that has grown by integrating itself dramatically with the rest of the world in all kinds of ways, but suddenly almost kind of finding itself not having as many friends in rooting for itself. And in fact, you can see exactly what happened when Trump took that next step that very few political leaders in the US had the stomach to do, which is to launch a trade war with China. Chinese are realizing, and this is based on the conversations I have with all my entrepreneurial friends in China, they feel like China really doesn't have too many friends, as US is challenging China. Nobody is stepping up and saying, geez, we will help you. In fact, everybody else is basically saying, thank God Trump is doing the dirty work, and we will cheer for him from the sidelines. And Europeans are cheering for this, Japanese are cheering for it. India has always been quietly kind of supportive of this effort. And so, China really is dependent on, countries in Africa maybe, but even they, I'm not so sure are, standing up that much. A few countries in Latin America, but and Russia itself, I'm not sure actually is quite ambivalent about the rise of China. And so it's not clear actually China has a lot of friends, as the US is pushing China to the brink through this trade war. And in fact, the impression I got from people that I speak with is a lot of people are saying that maybe Xi Jinping has overplayed his hand. Overplayed the hand first in prematurely changing the historic policy China had of not positioning itself as a strategic rival, but really quietly kind of grow economically, to taking on this aggressive strategic posture, and whether in fact that was a premature thing, and also picking a fight with your largest customer, which is what United States is for most of the companies that I deal with. In fact, the anti-Chinese economy is one giant corporation that is dependent on selling stuff to the US, and if your largest customer basically is mad at you, that's not good for you. And if you don't have any alternatives where you can go and sell your stuff, and you don't have domestic economy still strong enough to absorb all that capacity, picking a fight with your customer is premature. When you have that capacity, you can pick that fight. But right now, maybe you played your hand, too quickly. That's the sense I'm getting actually from Chinese. I'm relaying that to you. So there's a lot of kind of second guessing that is going on in China quietly. And in fact, you can see even the latest round of provocation by the arrest of the CFO of Huawei, how quietly China has reacted rather than belligerently, that historically it would have reacted in a circumstance like that vis-a-vis the US. So I think there is a rethinking going on in China about whether this is the right time to fight the US and the rest of the world together in some sense, or there is a better way to kind of think about it. And so as you just think about the future, I'm just going to lay a couple of scenarios. I don't know how to pick which scenario will play out, and I'd love to hear your views and we can then have a conversation. One is, China will use this, the 40-year anniversary, the negotiations with the US, to quietly kind of dial back. It's a strategic ambition, and say that $8,000 per capita income still is 1/6 of the per capita income of the US, and we have a lot of room to grow, and there is no reason why we should be doing anything other than focusing on continued growth and development of our economy. That would be one posture. And say we will dial back, we'll continue down the road that we used to be, which is to really leverage the rest of the world and cooperate with the rest of the world to continue to grow. And probably if that is the posture that China takes, I have a feeling that the rest of the world will be quite eager in kind of embracing that, because there's a lot of win-win for Chinese growth for the rest of the world. I don't see that as a win-lose proposition at all. There will be micro winners and losers at the individual company level or something, but at a global level, if China becomes wealthier, it actually will benefit everybody else. If there is a billion more wealthy people in the world, that with a per capita income of $30,000 rather than $6,000 or $8,000, there are a lot of people who will actually be able to sell things to them, benefit from their tourism, benefit from all kinds of things, and so it's actually a good thing. And if China also produces new innovations that will then be beneficial to the rest of the world, they have a lot of smart people, they have great universities, and so I can see a welfare enhancing scenario where China basically says, I want to focus on my growth and development, but that will benefit Chinese first and foremost, but will also benefit the rest of the world. There will be some frictions, there will be competition, rivalry, but that will be just business as usual. It's not a big deal kind of rivalry. I hope that's actually where we will end up. That would be good for everybody. But the other alternative would be that, and in fact at the Goa conference we had a couple of Chinese professors who live in Hong Kong, so they're not completely in China, one foot in China, that were actually telling me in the coffee break that they're very skeptical that would not happen. They think that Xi Jinping is quite vested primarily in achieving a strategic position for China, and even at the expense of economic growth. And if China takes that stand, then it obviously will be a zero-sum game between the US and China. And US probably will continue to use all the tools it has at its disposal to slow that down. At the minimum, that will lead to some kind of new Cold War of some kind. I could imagine economic cooperation declining, tremendous amount of barriers for intellectual capital to transfer from the West into China, because people will primarily see it through the lens of how that will be used for military and strategic purposes as opposed to for economic purposes. And so they will resist it, doing that. And exchanges between Chinese scholars and the rest of the world probably will be reduced too, because today, people have open access to the cutting-edge labs in MIT, Harvard, Stanford. That will reduce. The primary purpose of those visits is seen as enhancing Chinese military capability, that they will be slowing down of all that kind of stuff. And in fact, the worst case scenario is that we'll end up in a war of some kind. Hopefully not a World War III, but some kind of eruption in the Pacific as a test case to see actually who is the big shot there. It could happen in the context of Taiwan, it could happen in the context of shipping lanes, it could happen in the context of some of these smaller Asia Pacific nations and their fishing rights and something like that, where a dispute can arise, and I can imagine some military conflict showing up as a way to test all this stuff. That would be ugly, and I hope that won't be the direction that we will end up with. But there is a chance, actually, that that's where we will end up with. Then the last comment I want to make is just going to bring it home here. What does this all mean for India, in some sense? And you probably have thought about it a whole lot more than I have, but I just want to kind of say a couple of things there. Certainly, under scenario one, if China dials back its strategic ambition and essentially becomes a benign economic power and continues to grow, India needs to learn how to benefit from a neighbor becoming an economic superpower, essentially. And there are ways in which that can happen, and we need to kind of figure out how to benefit from trade, how to benefit from interchanges, technology exchanges, and so on. And there are complementary ways in which actually China and India can benefit from each other's experiences and capabilities. But I think it's not going to happen automatically, because there are lots of animosity I see and indifference that needs to be worked on, and also a lot of lack of knowledge. I'm not in this room, and it's an amazing thing that you actually have this great organization devoted to that. But I think you will be in really enhanced business at the Institute for Chinese Studies. There will be more demand for learning about China for the benefit of India, and that would be good. If there is more of a strategic rivalry kind of situation between the US and China, I think India will be drawn into that, and India has to think about actually how it will play that game. Would it join the coalition of the West and Japan in some kind of a Cold War situation, and is it good for India to be part of that or not? Or should it be somewhat neutral? Should we take advantage of that and replace China in many ways in the collaboration with West economically? For example, a lot of supply chains need to be replaced, and India could be a destination for that. A lot of technology development could actually be a place where China and India could actually start playing a role. And so there are ways in which India could benefit by thinking strategically, and I don't mean strategically in a military sense, but strategically in a sense of enlightened self-interest, to work with the rest of the world. If China takes a path, which I think, in my opinion, is an unwise path, because it's a path that is not good for Chinese people. And Chinese people still, several hundreds of millions of people in China that are poor. The 8,000 per capita income is an average, but there's a tremendous amount of income inequality. And so rather than focus on military adventurism, I think China would be better served, in my opinion, to focus on increasing the welfare of all those people. But should China choose to do that, India could benefit from it, because it's an unwise path for China, and if India takes a wiser path of being seen as a more benign, collaborative country in the global system, I think that India could actually tremendously benefit from that situation. So let me stop there. Sorry that I went on for a little while, but let me stop there and interact.
Well, actually, we're not at all sorry that you went on for a little while longer, because you covered such a wide range of issues in such a thoughtful manner. I'm sure colleagues present here will have a lot of questions and comments. So let me open for questions. what I'll request that please identify yourself and keep your question, comments as brief as possible. As you can see, we have a house full. So, okay, we can start.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, please. I will give you a mic.
You can use one of the mics on the table. Yes.
Hi, my name is Rajiv Sharma. I write for South Asian Monitor, Kuala Lumpur. You talked about taking bomb in one context. How do you reflect on reports of China having a deficit of $3 billion and also reports that the Chinese balloon is going to burst, bubble going to burst. I mean, there are all kinds of negative reports, rather concerning reports about this. Because when you talk of Third World War or a limited war or a trade war, whatever in whatever context, any nation's might stems from its economic might. Thank you.
Thank you for that really fascinating, I'm Shiv Shankar Madam. Thank you for that really fascinating lecture and for actually covering so much ground. I had two sort of questions. One is, can the US sustain this when, especially when you look at the bigger corporations, 24% of Apple's profits come from the US. You look at Boeing, she couldn't survive without China. Wall Street is, is addicted to Chinese money. So I'm not quite sure where, and can you give us a sense of how can the US sustain this? Because it's not only China having to bear the cost of alienating our biggest customer. The other side, I think there's a very strong argument to be made that China actually cannot change course. She can't go back to Heidenreich, keeping her head down, to that there are now so many vested interests. The role of the PLA in policy making has grown. When you look at that, and it's not just the last 5 years, it's actually been growing over time. And they've built this narrative since Tiananmen actually of the century of humiliation. It's now very difficult for the leadership in the Communist Party, certainly if it wants regime stability, to actually reverse course. But I'd like to know what you think about it, because you, as you said, you know the ground level, you know what, but not just firms, what the government officials and so on think.
If I can just add one related question. Mr. Menon asked, can China reverse, change course? My corollary is, can USA change course? Yeah, maybe he can respond and then we'll get back.
So, first thing about I'll pick up Mr. Menon, your question about the US's ability to sustain it. That's a very important issue. This was the reason why I think most US politicians actually were reluctant to go down this road. But Trump doesn't care. Actually, it's very important that you have a person in the White House who is unusual. And he's getting a lot of pressure from the usual vested interests not to fight China for the reasons that you mentioned in the corporations, the establishment in Wall Street. But I think he is redirecting the energy away from the people who used to have the ear of the White House to the common people who see this whole thing in a very different way. And that base is very large. It's not actually just Trump supporters. Trump supporters definitely see it that way, but there's a lot of Democratic base that sees it that way, historically Democratic base. And so he has actually, and a lot of Democratic politicians are quietly supporting him, more than Republican politicians, because Republican politicians are more beholden to these interests that you just described. And so the wild card here is what will happen to Trump. Will he go to jail? Will he get impeached? And will he leave too quickly? And also, I think the interesting thing about Trump is while he saber rattles a lot, in a way his goals are more modest. I don't think he wants to overturn the entire relationship with China. He just wants to be able to establish a new relationship that is incrementally different from and qualitatively different from today, which gives China, in my opinion, a way out. Because if it is fundamentally, toppling the whole thing, China will not be able to do it. But if it is at the margin, and also sending a message to China, and also China realizing through this skirmish that maybe it's not as strong as it thought, and therefore needs to kind of slow down on this path. So I can see a way out, which is actually going to be politically expedient both for Trump and Xi Jinping to dial back. It's not going to be radically different, but dial back a little bit and slowly change the course. And as you said, it's developing for a while, so it's not going to be overnight that all this stuff will be redone. And by the way, I don't think US will be opposed to the idea of recognizing China as a very powerful country and taking its rightful place in the power equilibrium in the world, but not in a way to be replacing the US or challenging US in ways where the rest of the world has invested a lot in kind of creating an understanding of how the world works, challenging shipping lanes, that are established, that kind of stuff. And so I think that there's probably a way that this can muddle through, but an awakening that maybe the current path is not the right way to be going down and finding a new collaborative way. And there is an ambiguous middle ground that both countries can live with for a while. It could be another decade, another 2 decades till things get resolved one way or the other. The other thing about China's power is the following. The frustration that a lot of people have in the US is that when there are pressing international problems, China is absent from the scene. So where is China in Syria? Where is China with respect to Iran? Basically, it just takes a pass in those kind of situations. Whereas it's, so in some ways, if it can direct its power to have its own input into how to address some of these things and kind of share the burden of power as well as the power itself, that would be a more constructive way to rise. Because nobody can deny that China will be a powerful country. I mean, if you're the second largest economy or the largest economy, you will be a powerful country. There's no question. The question is how are you going to deploy your power? And so the question is, can they find that middle ground? And I'm optimistic. We talked before, I'm a congenital optimist, and so I apologize for that. In terms of the point you're making, there are economic problems in China, but people who have been saying that China is going to collapse have been wrong for many, many years, and I think that that same thing I feel will be the case. It's only coupling with this friction that China could end up in economic difficulty because it has to fight all its battles on its own. If it is actually going to try to genuinely reform its economy, it will be in the interest of the rest of the world to help, and people will help, in fact. It's nobody's interest for China to collapse because it's so integrated with the rest of the world that China collapsing, maybe one day you can celebrate, and after that it will be a massive headache for everybody else, including for people in India. And so I don't think it's something that the rest of the world will want to happen unless China starts kind of becoming such a belligerent country that then you say, well, you made your bed, you sleep in it, and so you won't lend a hand. So that would be my thinking.
I just want to follow. I'm Vijay Naik, journalist. I just want to follow Mr. Menon, Ambassador Menon. When Trump went on having these duties on the Chinese products, don't you think that the Chinese consumer, the American consumer, is being affected in that? because the figures which came over there are about $175 billion of the computers and other electronic goods come from China to America. You see, when Trump talks of the Make in America, it doesn't have any kind of infrastructure to immediately provide those things to American consumers. And it is said that the duties which are passed on to China are affecting the consumers in China, in America, which means that out of $25, the $10, the price of the things have increased, and the American consumer is paying that money out of his own pocket actually. See. So how long the consumer can sustain these kind of, the tariffs on his pocket?
Sorry, Shirijit Nandi, very interesting talk. You spoke about how China views India. And I was wondering, in the two scenarios that you laid out, how would you characterize, you spoke about how India views China with a certain amount of wariness. How would you view how China views India in those two scenarios? Thanks.
Yeah, there was a Graham Allison's book stating Destined for War, where they said that a rising power will rival a ruling power, and like China is rising, and there'll be like a two-sided trap, and which will obviously result into war. How likely, it backs your second scenario. How likely is it, and how will it impact the whole world scenario?
Thank you, Chair. I'm Dr. Krishna and I teach Chinese in JNU. I was thinking about the labor productivity that you were talking about, and I would want to go before the reform period, where actually the foundation was laid by Mao Zedong saying, the women should be a part of the whole labor productivity. And probably if I see the models of Zhejiang, as a success model, which has really boosted the economy, I think women have played a greater role in that. So how do you see the labor productivity in China different from India? And considering that, what China is now doing is by abolishing the one-child policy, again, focusing on this labor productivity as such. So 20-25 years down the line, we again see a different kind of a scenario, which is the focus or the aim of China in terms of becoming, again, a very superpower or something like that. And related to that, I was really wondering when you're saying that China is having this kind of threat with the US and war. I was going back to what Ambassador Ashokanta has said in the beginning of benign hegemony, which Yan Shuitong is talking about. I think what China is trying to do is to link with the regional powers. First become as a regional global player, lead in the region, and then take as the global position. Probably that is the 20-year scenario which China can wait and move ahead. Your comments on that. Thank you.
So on the tariffs, you're absolutely right. Tariffs are a ruinous policy for everybody. I think the mistake you could be making is that Trump is thinking of tariffs as a permanent situation. He's just using it as a way to bring China to the table, which he succeeded, basically, and got their attention. And he would like to get rid of tariffs as quickly as possible, actually. But if you didn't have the tariffs, there is no way China was actually paying attention to all the entreaties and pleas that the US was making for the longest time. And they were counting on the fact that actually the political pressure and the consumer pressure would prevent US presidents from going down this road. In fact, people that I spoke with in China, that's precisely what they were saying, that they were stunned that actually Trump would follow through on his promise, because a lot of politicians in the US talked about it but never followed through. So they kind of assumed that it's not possible in the US for a politician to go down this road. Only because he's an unusual politician, I think that they were surprised by his willingness to go down this what looks like a ruinous path. Trump does a lot of things that are not correct. I mean, in the sense that tariffs are not going to reduce trade deficits. If you want to reduce trade deficits, you need to reduce consumption, basically, in the US. So this is not a solution to trade deficits, but this is a solution to rebalancing the relationship between China and the US in a way that may be more symmetric than it was when China was a very poor country. And there were a lot of one-sided concessions that the US made that no longer wants to make today. So that's how I think about it. So it's a short-term thing. It's not a long-term thing. I'm going to kind of not go down the order of the questions, but I'll use it in a way to kind of narrate maybe. Graham Allison's work is very interesting. A good friend of mine read the book. It's a great book. There is no inevitability to that thing, but that's one path that can most certainly take place. But there have been countries that have risen economically that are not viewed by the rest of the world as a threat in any way. Korea is an example of a country that has risen a lot. So it's a question of actually how you're relating to the rest of the world. And if you if you in fact achieve this kind of a strategic vision that you were talking about a benign hegemon that is a junior partner of the US, is really going to contribute to the welfare of other societies, and that's why it's going to be accepted as a leader in some sense. A hegemon is a word, but actually better would be a leader, because a leader does those kind of things, which is a leader is not self-centered. A leader is somebody who thinks about the whole community. Then China will be accepted as a leader. There's no question why it shouldn't be. It will have the resources, it will have the capacity, and it will have the respect of people if it uses those resources to help address the issues. But there is very little evidence today that actually that's what China is doing in the eyes of a lot of people. Because wherever there is a suffering going on, China is not jumping in. What happened in Myanmar? Did China show up to deal with the Rohingya crisis? What happened in Syria when there is a bombing of civilians? Is China showing up? So this idea that somehow we're going to use our leadership to increase welfare of people, you have to have evidence before people will buy into it. And part of the reason why people are willing to buy into that bargain with the US is because however imperfect US is, it has a record of ultimately using its resources and power to help other people when they're in trouble. So it has to put the down payment first, I think, before people will buy into that. And by the way, part of the down payment is actually whether you're a benign power in your own country. That is, if you have a political system that becomes oppressive and a blind Nobel laureate is seen as a threat enough to have to be jailed in the country, it's kind of hard to sell this idea that you're a benign hegemon. And so there has to be a lot of changes for that packaging to work. It's a good vision, but it doesn't automatically happen, I think. And then the issue of China's view of India, it's kind of interesting. First of all, there's a lot of ignorance of India in China, just as much I see the opposite way here too. That is, the number of flights between China and India is stunningly low. So actually the amount of knowledge, I think, of India is not as high as it should be. People, it's kind of, we see much more a rivalry between India and China in India. China sees itself really rivaling United States and not India. And it doesn't see itself in the same league. It sees itself in a different league, actually kind of competing for world power. And so there is that kind of asymmetry in our conception of what China is preoccupied with versus what China really is preoccupied with, which is to be really more of a competitor to the US. So they're actually having a higher kind of aspiration. And in the process, India is, certainly as the part of rising, if India is coming in the way of the regional dominance that China wants to establish, something of the variation of Monroe Doctrine or something like that, that says this is my sphere of influence. That's where India becomes a very important issue, because India would be one country that can stop it from happening, or at least challenge it from happening, and would not accept it automatically. And so that would be probably how they view India in their regional dominance. I just want to make one offhand comment that connects all these things. China has one functioning aircraft carrier, and it's building a second one. The first one I don't think has really gone too far from the coast. Think of how much China depends on the United States for protecting the shipping lanes in the Gulf for energy flow. US has become pretty much energy independent. It's the largest producer of oil and gas today in the world. So one could imagine a scenario where it's not going to be Trump, but it could be Bernie Sanders, who says we're spending too much money on defense, let's bring our aircraft carriers home, and let's just rely on domestic kind of production of oil and gas and Canadian production, and not worry as much about the Gulf. China actually will be screwed, because it doesn't have the capacity to protect the shipping lanes. And so this dependency is enormous, much more than we actually think on the surface. And this is the premature kind of challenging, in my opinion. So as you kind of work your way through on the day-to-day functioning of the world, and how much China is benefiting from the investment that US makes in making sure that the rest of the world is orderly, I think China understands it actually, and probably is really asking the US to allow it to be a more regionally dominant power at this point. And US is resisting that, because their allies, US allies including Taiwan, that would not like it, India would not like it. And so it's really much more limited kind of strategic rivalry we're talking about, I think.
Thank you, sir. I'm Uday with the Institute of Chinese Studies. I just want to draw a line between two things. What do you think the impact of tariff impositions will be on market-led innovation in particular? I suspect there may be a link. Thank you.
Well, China is now looking more inwards. What do you think about, do you think this will affect somehow the political system in China? Will it change or something else will happen? Will it implode? Second point is, how do you look at, few things which have happened recently, that is the Bing Bing disappearing for a few months, coming back, Jack Ma announcing, okay, I'll step down. So what do you look at it, how do you look at it? And many incidents of this kind, smaller ones, have happened in China.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. My name is Kartar Kapoor. I'm a student of Balanced Comparative Studies in Evolution of Histories. My question, I have two small questions, sir. The first is, in respect of what you have stated, political system repressive, less democratic. Not only you, the whole world is talking about it. Having not many friends, picking a fight with the customers, and I would say neighbors as well. China is picking a fight with neighbors all along the border. Apart from all this, it has been said and assumed from the right inception of the state that all these allegations are there. But they have moved from $300 per capita to $8,000. I don't know what's the mystery. That's one. Number two, you said in case of Cold War between West and the China, India could join the Cold War of the West. I would say, sir, humble submission, we are the neighbors. And bearing that in mind, we cannot afford that. And the best India can do to be neutral. Thank you.
So I'm Veda from ICS. I had a simple question. What are your thoughts on the China model? Is there such a model? Because while talking to scholars from from Africa, for instance, when they talk about, why SGR, why does it cost so much? The constant focus point seems to be, but China needed infrastructure to grow like this. Or what do you think about the debt? Is that a point of worry? But, China also had a lot of debt. So your thoughts on the China model?
The political system, just on that one, this is true for actually many dictatorships. If you're an average Chinese and you're minding your business, basically, the political system is actually somewhat irrelevant. And so for a very, very large fraction of Chinese citizens, the political system is just in the background. I was actually very surprised because I had these kind of feelings too, but when I lived there, you go to the city hall, things get done exactly what you want, and the procedures followed, and as long as you're keeping your head down, doing your thing, you're not challenging the political leadership of the country, either in terms of some kind of challenge to the Communist Party, it really doesn't matter to you. So the vast majority of people in China actually are unaffected, and perhaps even at the margin are happy that there is more political control, because the political control is being used in two ways: the increased political control. One, to fight corruption, which a lot of people are fed up with, and therefore they think actually it's a good thing for them, or against politically inconvenient people. That is, these are people that are challenging the system somehow. And for an ordinary person, that's like a fight between two people, and I don't care, that as long as my life is improving and my kids are able to have a better life than I did, I'm okay. And so somehow the system collapsing, I don't see it actually from within. That's really more for the rest of us who love freedom, democracy. We might actually look at that and say, boy, it's a big problem. But for average Chinese, I don't think there is going to be an organic kind of disruption. The disruption will come if the economy stagnates, and if the economy starts going backwards, and if people actually feel frustrated that their life is not improving. That's really the biggest threat to the Communist Party. I don't think that the political system alone is a threat. In terms of the China model, I described what the China model is, basically. And you can't pick and choose among them, saying that I just have debt, but not use it in a way that gives me tremendous scale to export to very competitive marketplace where customers are very demanding. If you didn't do that, actually that could come back to bite you. And so you either have to do all of it or none of it. And I don't think China has actually done anything, in my view, that defies conventional economics that much. On the economic front, if anything, they have demonstrated the power of market-based incentives, the power of doing a lot of things that economists would say you need to do to grow the economy. I don't think they've done anything that different. In terms of speed with which they're able to make some decisions, having a politically strong government helps. So I'm actually quite skeptical of the idea that there is some kind of parallel Chinese model or something like that. In terms of other points quickly on tariffs and its impact on innovation, again, I see tariffs really as a temporary state of affairs. I don't think this is going to be a permanent thing. It's not good for anybody, and both sides will want to dial back that stuff as quickly as it can be done. So I don't see this. The tariffs is just in my opinion, a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, and I don't think we should be paying as much attention to tariffs as some of these other consequences that I've been talking about. And in terms of India joining Cold War, who am I to tell what India should be doing? Indians should be deciding it. More power to you. I'm not recommending that you should do one or the other. I'm just pointing out the possibilities and a calculus that needs to happen in groups like this, so that actually people make the wisest choice in that area.
And so the mystery of going from 300 to 8,000.
Yeah, that one I described actually. It's not a mystery at all. That's in fact what I spent the first 15-20 minutes describing. There are very series of choices that Chinese government has made, and policy-wise, and implementing them in a ruthlessly efficient way that actually led to that growth. So it's not a mystery at all. You need to separate that story from the strategic rivalry story, I think. And that story has a lot of richness and it can continue. And I think China can continue to grow at some modest rate of 6%, 5% for another 20 years if it follows wise policies and doesn't pick fights with everybody. And I hope that's what it does actually, because it will be good for all of us and Chinese.
Well, we have run out of time. Last round of questions. Please keep your questions very short. Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
My name is Anand. I worked for the government earlier. I had a small opportunity to see the entire rebalancing debate and the exchange rate debate. And my question pertains to that. You just mentioned that they didn't do anything out of the book in terms of the economic policy, but you also mentioned in the beginning that they followed fairly extreme form of financial repression, which they continue to do so. So long as they do that, what prevents them from fueling consumption the way they have done for investment? And so long as they don't open up the financial markets. I mean, even today they keep very low interest rates, which is a huge differentiator with the rest of the world. It is quite a different policy from what typically the IMF or the standard policies that are being followed elsewhere.
Okay. Yes. Very, very brief, please.
So you talk about the relationship between the producers and the income of their labor. So how it is used in Indian context?
Okay.
Good evening, Professor. I work for the Policy Planning and Research Division of the MEE. You spoke of bipartisan consensus emerging in the US on tackling China on trade tariffs issue. A similar bipartisan consensus seems to be emerging in the US on trying to needle China on Xinjiang and Tibet, which arguably are two of China's underbellies. For example, there is a bill pending in the Congress on which seeks to obligate the US government to punishing Chinese officials who deny visas to Americans who try to enter the Tibet Autonomous Region. There's another bill titled the Uyghur Human Rights Act 2018, which obligates the US federal government into acting on Chinese officials who indulge in human rights violations in Xinjiang. It obligates US federal government to target US businesses that aid in the human rights violations. So you see this process as it goes through. Do you think this is going to be an effective tool in America's armory against China? And how vulnerable is China in the backdrop of developments on the trade front and in the Pacific? Thank you.
Your thoughts on the Belt and Road Initiative and the Chinese debt trap?
Very small All in 5 minutes.
Yeah, on the financial system control, China is not the first one that actually did it. Japan has done it for a long time, managed the financial system exactly like this. Korea has done it. Both of them ended up in a crisis at some point. In fact, Japan has never been able to recover from the crisis because they never dealt with it. Korea dealt with it and therefore actually has been able to bounce back. And so this is not something that you can continue forever because it's like you're laying the seeds of destruction in the economy, and you can go on with it for a while, but if there is a way to kind of dial back, it will work, or there has to be a crisis that will force you to kind of redo it. So I don't think they can continue that. And everybody, by the way, I spoke with, and they're very intelligent people in the Financial Regulatory Authority, Ministry of Finance, people in the banking system, CEOs of major banks, they all know that this is a problem that they need to deal with. And there are many symptoms of actually release valves that Chinese government is allowing to slowly kind of dissipate it. But they this is like privatization of Air India. It's not easy. You might want to do it, but it's not easy to do. And you know all the complications. There's people getting free vacations, on Air India. So it's not about Air India itself. It's about the entire kind of political economy. It's the same thing about the banks. On the wages and productivity, again, there's a limit to that, and I think lack of unions has allowed China to do that in terms of and productivity growth being very high. So it's not like people were not getting a raise; they were not getting 10% raise. Instead, they were getting a 5% raise. But if you're getting 5% raise, that's at least good enough, and so that's the bargain. But you can't continue that, and because the productivity growth rate is slowing down. If it is only 6%, and you give 5% raise, you're passing on most of it. But also, if you're trying to encourage domestic consumption, then you can't play that game as much. And so I think that there's a limit to that, and I don't see that also as continuing in China. The Belt and Road Initiative, by the way, is one mechanism through which China was hoping to continue this export-led kind of strategy away from the West into economies that are growing and need the kind of things that China can do, and they saw it as a complementary stuff. There's only one catch. When you export to the US, they have the money to pay. When you export to many of the Belt and Road recipients, they don't have the capacity to pay. And you already have that problems at home, and you are now financing all these things abroad. It doesn't work, and that's the reason why they're very quick to call on those debts, and then those countries feel the pressure, they don't like it, and so it's at the margin a good strategy, but it's going to be a band-aid. It's not going to be dramatically kind of addressing the core problem. It's going to just postpone the debt problem, and we talked about the debt problem, which is a real issue, and everybody knows it. It's not like people are ignorant of it. It's a hard problem. They're trying to hope that they don't have to take a sudden U-turn to do that, and having capital controls helps, that you can actually slow down the reform. But it's like being half pregnant. It's not easy to do that. On the and I will address the question you really asked, and I apologize for not addressing it before. I think this human rights issue in Uyghur region as well as Tibet is of concern to some people in the US, but I don't think it actually drives US policy. It will become a prominent piece of any Cold War. There is actually a Cold War and a strategic rivalry. US absolutely will put a spotlight on these things and kind of try to educate the international community about all the bad things that China is doing, and so they will use it. But if there is going to be a more benign, collaborative kind of world, Tibet has been there for years, and the US has not been pushing that, and I don't think they will continue to do that either way. There will be human rights organizations that will push it. New York Times will publish articles, and there will be bills in Congress that will be put on place but not passed, and there will be a lot of ritualistic kind of flogging of this thing, but I don't think it will be the central stuff. On the women's role, you made a really good point, and one thing about China, and this is like foreign minister of Singapore once told me this. He is his HBS, the former foreign minister of Singapore. He said, the difference between India and China is that China basically destroyed its house and rebuilt it. India is trying to repair its house while it's living there, and that's the difference. And so part of the destruction of the old system is kind of getting rid of, policies that were very unfavorable to women, for example, and making much more egalitarian kind of society on some dimensions. So despite all the ugliness of Great Leap Forward and cultural evolution, there were some positive things, including the role of women in society, I think, in China. It's not all bed of roses for women, but definitely in some areas they actually are far better than in many other countries in the world. And that really does help the economy, because women's participation in labor force is much higher, their access to health care and education is much better, so they actually contribute to productivity a whole lot more. So your point is well taken on that point.
I'm afraid we'll have to bring it to closure now. So, thank you very much, Professor Palepu, for that absolutely fascinating, session we had with you. The range of issues that you cover from China model, how China is developed, to challenges for China, to how China is engaging with the rest of the world, and likely scenarios of what's going to happen. On all those issues, you spoke with great clarity, great lucidity, and not giving either or, that kind of thing. You stated your point of view very clearly. Thank you very much for that. I think we have benefited a lot from your remarks, and equally from Q&A session that followed subsequently. So, on behalf of everyone, let me thank you, and please join me in giving a big hand of